I'd like to learn a little bit more about some of the things you mentioned, both of you, talking about the history, the diversity training. I know you also do some workshops on dismantling racism. If you'd like to talk about those things and maybe Unity Day, some other things that have come out of the works that you do, I'd really appreciate that.
Sure. Race Unity Day was introduced to us by a physician and his wife that moved here. Forgot where they came from, but they was Iran, and they were of the Baha'i faith. And they introduced us to Race Unity Day, which the center sponsored for 20 plus years. It was the second Sunday in June. And we started that I think in 1989, and the last one was probably 2014, 2015. But we also do what is called Dismantling Racism workshops. And we actually got this concept from Virginia Organizing Project, VOP. They developed this syllabus that we pulled from. Actually, I was trained with VOP. The executive director, Joe Sakos, and I went to Austin, Texas to be trained as facilitators for this Dismantling Racism workshops. We really didn't want to copy VOP. I'm sure they had the copyrights. So our sessions are called anti-racism workshops. And what we do is we create a safe place where people will come in and just talk about race. We have a 1-day workshop and we have a 2.5-day workshop. But a lot of times we just do discussions, afternoon discussions on white privilege, internalized Black oppression, and institutionalized racism. And it's just a way of just talking and being honest with yourself. You know, there are no words off the table. And
this is something that I was sitting here trying to remember how we even got into this, but one of the things that I didn't mention was after moving here, I worked for the school system for 10 years in the Head Start program as their fiscal officer, and then became an organizer, community organizer then it was called Virginia Organizing Project, and today is known as Virginia Organizing out of Charlottesville. And actually, the first chapter of that organization began in the Cultural Center. And that's where we met this person that Ron mentioned, Joe Sakos. And Joe had been instrumental in organizing what's known as Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. And the whole idea of this group is to give a voice to the voiceless. And as I mentioned, I became a community organizer with that group. And I think that had much to do with why I got elected to the town council here, because as a community organizer, I met a lot of people, talked to a lot of people, heard what people had to say, heard about any issues that were concerning people in the community. But as Ron said, the whole foundation of this work comes from the workshop that Virginia Organizing had developed. And I think that, and we have used this with many people, many groups throughout the region. I think since the George Floyd situation, it's taken on a whole new picture, a whole new meaning. It has put us in a place where we've been taking another look at the whole concept of the workshop as it existed and how we can perhaps bring it more up to date and think changes that we can make to it. And one of the things I think that really jumped out at us began with the situation in Marion. And I don't know, how familiar you are with that.
I am.
Mm,
And so for our folks who may not be familiar with this, the town of Marion, which is in far southwest Virginia as well, in Smith County, has had some protests and marches as well. And unfortunately, one of the young gentlemen who's one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement in Marion found a burning cross in his front yard. And now that's been under investigation. I know that the federal government's been involved, but that's the incident I think that Jill is talking about. So.
Well, and when that unfortunate situation happened, Ron and I were contacted. Well, it involved a person by the name of Ken Heath. That I'm not even sure what Ken's title is, but he's very actively involved in the town of Marion. And the police chief contacting us about the situation in Marion and asking if there was anything that Ron and I could do. What jumped out at us immediately was the fact that they had to reach so far, because we're like maybe 2 hours from Marion. Why are they having to come to us? And the young man that Charles has referred to, his name is Trayvon Brown, and he lives with his mom, and he's 17 years old, and they had a cross burned in their yard. We were put into contact with a young man older than Trayvon, who was involved with a group called the New Panther Initiative. They, for some who may or may not be familiar, they were involved in a situation in Johnson City, Tennessee, which is right across the road here, at a pawn shop where a number of people in that group, made up of blacks and whites, very diverse group, had gone into a pawn shop trying to buy guns. The young man, Trayvon Brown, had organized what he called a protest march scheduled for a certain date in Marion. These folks are going to go up in support of Trayvon in this march. We were put into contact with the young man that was leading this group and try to find out from him what he hoped to accomplish by going to Marion. And he wasn't too receptive to us. And we had to recognize the fact that we had age difference there too. We had to take that into account.
Generation gap.
A generation gap.
Yeah.
And taking that into account and really weren't making much headway with him. He then agreed to put us into contact with Trayvon. Let Trayvon tell you what he wants. So we got in touch with Trayvon, talked to him. Nice young man who said, I just want to be able to live in peace with my mother. I'm 17 years old. I just want fairness and equity. I want to be able to go to school and get a good education. He had a laundry list of what he wanted. He says, that's all that I'm looking for. I don't want any trouble. I don't want any violence, and he was very, very clear about that. And so that began our relationship with him. And in talking to Ken, he and the police chief from Marion, John Clare is his name, they were seeing where these other groups were coming in, and I can only refer to them as supremacist groups because that's exactly what they were. We're planning some kind of a protest march as well on the same day. Their march was scheduled for 1 o'clock that day, and Trayvon's march was scheduled for 2. They were asking us if we could get Trayvon to change the time of his protest, which would allow them more time and would hopefully get some of the groups from the 1 o'clock people from the 1 o'clock group to disseminate. So that, as well as to talk to Trayvon about the plan for his march to try to shorten the distance. So they thought if we could make those two things happen, have the time change, shorten the distance, then they would be able to control the situation. And you must understand the fact that there was a cross burning made this a hate crime. So the FBI was on board. They had snipers on the rooftops. I mean, this was making for a very, very volatile situation. And again, Trayvon didn't know us, but he did listen to us. So long story short, we were able to, meet the needs as presented to us to help, to give them a better way to control the situation. And long story short, it went off, it was uneventful. There were no arrests, there was no violence. So that worked out well. And it was from that we started asking ourselves, why is it that they had to reach so far? And there were other events that were being scheduled in Elizabethton, Tennessee, not far from here, as well as Rogersville, that is not far from here, being primarily led by the folks from the new Panther Initiative group. And these two have small Black communities, elderly Black communities. Again, what was to be gained from that kind of approach? And we started looking at our packet, our anti-racism packet, or our dismantling racism packet, which had really focused on white privilege. We have a woman that works with us in doing these workshops, and she's white. She focuses on white privilege, that piece. We focus on the anti-racist oppression piece. And but we started looking at the oppression piece. And we began to realize that this really needed our attention. That the mere fact that they weren't able, and this is what they told us in Marion, they weren't able to find any Black leaders in Marion through the churches or otherwise. And then further examination showed that same thing existed with Elizabethton and all those small Black communities around us, a lack of Black leadership. So that then led us to really, really talk about refocusing this workshop. One thing that we didn't mention was that shortly after the George Floyd situation, candlelight vigil was held in Big Stone Gap in Wise County in response to that. And one was also held here in response to that, here in Pennington. And unfortunately, what we saw was that Black people that attended did not,
Some.
not all, but way too many stood on the periphery of the group. They did not come into the group. They sat in their cars. They didn't come into the group. Same kind of thing happened here with some of the Blacks. So why is that happening? Is this what we're talking about when we talk about institutionalized racist oppression? So we started thinking about that and how things played out in the Black community. We'll go back to the cultural center and our experience and building on that. And we found with the Black community here, they stepped away from that as well. And it took us a long time to realize, particularly me, coming from Boston, took a while for me to realize and understand that the reason why we weren't getting the support from the Black community was because it was too hard. They did not want to revisit those days when they were going to that one-room school and the racism that they had experienced during that time. And actually, in having conversation with them later on, they were asking, why would you want to do that? We don't want to revisit that. And so I think that has much to do with this oppression that we're talking about, and how do we get past that? How do we deal with that? But we feel very strongly, and I think I can speak for Ron on this, is that that's something that we're going to have to resolve as a people and as a community before we can even begin to address some of those other systemic problems that we have in our society today. We've got to really do some thinking on how to empower the people in the Black community. How can we do that so that we can be effective in what we do to address systemic racism and that kind of thing? So that's the biggest turn I think that we've taken with our plan with the anti-racism workshop.